Paul's often considered a kind of sexist jerk. And there's often some resignation or tension or even hostility when we start talking about how women are portrayed in the Bible. And yet the early church was flooded with far more women than men. In fact, it was flooded with a lot of slaves. See my video on Philemon to understand why. It was so lopsided that Christianity was mocked for being a religion for women and children. Tatian recalls that the Greeks who wrote against Christianity, quote, "They say that we talk nonsense among women and boys, among maidens and old women." We don't hear much about how, for the first 100 to 200 years, women were deeply involved with the growth of the church. Something was happening in this community that was incredibly compelling to women. I think we often miss this because of a common problem. We don't see the forest for all the trees. In other words, we get hung up on some of the trees blocking our view. The sections that talk about submission and headship and obedience and don't speak in church and cover your head. And we miss the beauty of the landscape. My goal is to help us see the forest and understand the beauty of the forest and how actually when you see the trees in that context, they look pretty fine indeed. We have to start by understanding what the Mediterranean world would have looked like when Jesus lived and when the Bible was written. Most of the discussion will be about married people because the culture was built around the family. However, the principles are broader, so if you're single, hang with me. There's a gold mine here too. So as far back as the 4th century BC, there's a record that the Greeks viewed the household to be a miniature and crucial version of the order found in the realm of the gods. Rome believed the family unit was a microcosm of the state, and the state was meant to mirror the life of the gods, therefore the family was too. So as the family went, so went the country. The gods would bless the country to the degree that the people mirrored the life of the gods. For this reason, Rome insisted in the stability of family structure. When occasional groups would spring up and promote a different style, Rome would crush them as seditionists or traitors. In fact, the crimes of the early church often involved the potential disruption of social hierarchy. Aristotle had identified 3 key relationships within the household that mattered. The smallest and primary parts of the household are master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. These developed into what was called household codes, a list of obligations that wives, children, and slaves had to the husband or the father. Many other codes have survived, but they all follow the same basic pattern. Women, children, and slaves, they submit, they obey. Aristotle had claimed that the one gender is far superior to the other in just about every sphere. And he also said that women had the ability to deliberate about things, but without authority. An upper-class Greek or Roman husband was the paterfamilias, the head of the family, like Augustus was the head of Rome and Zeus was the head of the gods. His word was law. His wife, kids, and slaves were all technically possessions. He could kill his children or divorce his wife. If his wife didn't meet the needs of her husband in any way, she could be beaten. Sarah Rudin, who wrote a fantastic book called Paul Among the People, notes that men believed that they were entitled to extract sex from their wives by violence. In fact, it's a common meme in Greco-Roman literature. If a wife would not have sex, she could be beaten. Many men, especially the aristocrats, had 3 significant women in their lives. There was their wife, their mistress, and their concubine. One Greek statesman and orator said, "We have hetairai for our pleasure, concubines for our daily needs, and wives to give us legitimate children and look after the housekeeping." Marriage was typically, though not always, functional and political. The reason for marriage was primarily for wives to bear legitimate children and keep the family line going. The hetairai were mostly ex-slaves from other cities, known for dance and for music and their intellect. They were educated and they took part in the discussions that men had. Athenaeus explained the allure of them. He said, quote, "Is not a companion," that's the hetairai, "more kindly than a wedded wife?" Yes, far more, and with very good reason. For the wife, protected by law, stays at home in proud contempt, whereas the harlot knows that a man must be bought by her fascinations or she must go out and find another. It was a shame for women to speak in public venues unless they were the hetairai or rare aristocrat. Aristotle wrote in Politics, "Silence is a woman's glory." The ecclesia, or the assembly, was a man's domain. Wives didn't even join their husbands at meals when topics of significance were discussed. The few times we have record of women giving speeches, they brought shame on their family even if the speech was praised. Oration was for men, and female orators were mocked for not being male. When one woman defended herself publicly against an accusation, Valerius Maximus described her as androgynous, apparently implying she had entered the male sphere by speaking in public. Several Roman writers instruct women to just go home and be quiet. One ancient inscription reads this way: Theano, the wife of Pythagoras, in putting her cloak about her exposed arm, somebody exclaimed, "A lovely arm." "But not for public," said she. Not only the arm of the virtuous woman, but her speech as well, ought to be not for the public, as she ought to be modest and guarded about saying anything in the hearing of outsiders, since it is an exposure of herself, for in her talk she can be seen her feelings, character, and disposition. While some aristocratic women were well educated, they were the exception. Learning and debate were also considered masculine traits. Juvenal argued that it was exasperating for a woman to discuss Virgil and Homer at the dinner table. Such a wife might as well cross-dress or worship and bathe with men. He finally concluded, wives shouldn't try to be public speakers. They shouldn't use rhetorical devices. They shouldn't read all the classics. There ought to be some things women don't understand. If she has to correct somebody, let her correct her girlfriends and leave her husband alone. Livy thought women should ask questions to their husbands at home, but he cautioned, as soon as they begin to be your equals, they will have become your superiors. Now, there were some Stoic and Epicurean philosophers who stressed the dignity of women and encouraged their education. This was not the approach everywhere. The Greeks were far more open to this, but the Romans generally made a connection between increasing freedom of women and the breakdown of morals in family. Russ Duttery noted, good Roman wives demonstrate their character by a word which is often translated as chastity, but includes modesty and domesticity. By respecting and honoring their husbands, by working faithfully to manage the domestic affairs of their household. Piety, chastity, and modesty were in such widespread use that the words were often given abbreviations on the tombstones of women. Above all, women needed to stay in the private sphere. There they were given great leeway in the private sphere of their own homes, business, education, the raising of children, social connections, etc. They were in fact very skilled and capable, and among their circle of female friends there were often thriving businesses. There was decent money to be made through manufacturing and trade, and plenty of women, including some prominent members in the early church, did this. There was also a lot of gossip and slander, which is no surprise considering the quality of the men around them. There's plenty of surviving literature that notes rebellion, jealousy, extravagant waste. In other words, what that society would have considered the bringing of shame and not honor to the father or husband. And let's be honest, in this venue, it would certainly seem tough to find good reasons to try to bring honor to them. Perhaps that's why in the first century there was the rise of what was called the New Roman woman. She was brazen, flirtatious, loud, and immodest. She piled her hair full of gold and riches as a way to show off her wealth and status. They may have been trying to break the glass ceilings of the time, but because of their approach, people generally saw them as annoying at best and shameful at worst. Now let's add to that some religious dynamics. At this time, Eastern religions were making a push, specifically the cult of Isis. Women were gravitating toward this style of temple worship. There were some pretty wild temple priestesses who were publicly loud and very immodest. The general public didn't like them, and Roman authorities were greatly concerned about Isis worship because they thought female worshippers of Isis had too much power over their husbands, go back to the family as a microcosm of the state, etc. In addition, it seems like some false teachings were coming into the early Christian church through the women simply because they weren't educated enough in their faith to be discerning. We'll see this come up when we get to 1 Timothy. While Judaism had always offered a better life for women than the surrounding cultures, there was work to be done. Though women had a lot of domestic authority, see Proverbs 31. Men had dominant power in the marriage, clearly. Women had more rights than most other cultures, but husbands could still divorce their wives basically at a whim. Judaism didn't oppose education for women, but only as long as it didn't distract them from their duties at home. There have been several women who had significant influence on rabbinical teaching, but they were the outliers. Women weren't considered inferior by nature, but they were believed to be untrustworthy. They couldn't testify in court because their word carried so little weight. Godly Jewish women were to cover their heads because hair was seen as sexually enticing. One rabbi wrote, "What is the transgression of the law in Moses and the Jews? If she goes out with her hair unbound, or spins in the street, or talks to everyone." Women who violated this law could be divorced without compensation. Their role in the synagogue was usually minor, which came from a complicated mix of being exempt from the obligations of men, because being a mom was demanding, and then not having the education that men did. They sometimes worshiped separately from the men, so men would not be distracted, probably by their hair, and so that no one would confuse them with some fertility cult, like what was happening with the cults of Isis. It's in this setting that writers like Paul and Peter have to show that this brand new church community was a new humanity crafted by Jesus in such a way that it was bringing life and hope and goodness into this particular culture.